lots of contributions and ideas, so we had to reduce that down to some bullet points, which made my life easier. So the first one was that it helped, all the projects seem to have helped in terms of the humanising of the subject. So World War I was quite vast, enormous topic with lots of numbers and lots of dates and various things. And picking up on all the varied topics and themes and ways in which the topic could be engaged, it was clear that suddenly communities were able to get an idea of the human dimensions of the war and the way it affected people and so on. That was one good one. Another was the totalising nature of World War I, which is that it wasn't simply about battlefields and so on in the trenches, but involved the entirety of societies, and it changed societies in a way that the different changes became the new normal for a period. So, the role of women increasing and women's football or various other aspects, it became normal within, on the home front and across various parts of the world. You could imagine how tense it would have been in Europe, under occupied time. So, the new normal that would be created there as well. So all these different ways of looking at it, but how it transforms societies in Britain and across the world. The third one was, we could come past this one here, but so the third was, how do you measure that community change in attitude and understanding of heritage? How do you come to know this? Because some of which you might be able to know there and then or at the end of the project, but there's a lot going on which you won't know and may never know, and it may not be within your reach, within the project's capacities. So that was a key question. Something else that emerged, another bullet point that we have from it all, and this is all reduced down, of course, was access, affirmation and ownership, so that what these projects were doing were making this topic more accessible, whether it's the skills, whether it's the themes, the topics, the research. It was affirming, it was validating groups and communities in lots of ways that in every case you could see how all of the projects took these particular groups and the topics to whom they related and making them real and not simply tokenistic, that there were substantial involvements from different communities and aspects of history in that regard. And finally, ownership, so that all the groups studying or learning about this realise that they can have an ownership in that heritage or in that history, that whether you're Muslim or you're Caribbean or whether you're working class or you're a woman, there were significant elements within that broader narrative that related to you, and they weren't tokenistic again, they were substantial. And the final one was that the question needed interrogating, really, which was the academic response, because it was seemingly a bit clunky and we could break it down further. So I think those are the 5 bullet points we've got.
Do your public consultation right was a big one. Give it time, give it space, talk to lots of people, be prepared for things to fall through, be prepared for some people to have very high expectations or quite low ones, work with that. It will stand you in good stead as a foundation for going forward. It will help you get your funding right, your funding bids right, because if you're asked to provide evidence of need, you've actually got tangible evidence. And also you will hopefully then have a project going forward that the local people actually want to do, rather than turning up and saying to them, I've had this bright idea, we're going to talk about goldfish during World War I. So that was very good. There was a lot of conversation about the need for flex, for unexpected directions in research that can only come out as the accumulation of the project starts. So you're six months in, you suddenly find that actually the big project on fly fishing is not working out because there's no documentation, but we've got an enormous amount about trawler fishing. Okay, can we go that way? And also for things like your volunteer and your community input to either suddenly realise that the scheduling is wrong and they can't do it, or for them to grow and sort of expand like silly putty and fill the holes in your project, because sometimes you're fitting volunteers to a project demand, sometimes you're fitting your project to what the volunteers are bringing to you, and there's that constant dialogue. Izzy's nodding his head off, so we've been there. So if you can, factor in contingency or be prepared to retrench. And sometimes that means going back to your funders. So one of the big things I always do with small community groups is to encourage them to keep an open dialogue with their funders as much as with their other partners, because people are quite nervous about going back to people and saying, actually, I've had a problem. funders have got a lot of experience of things going a bit wibbly, so they'll sort of, you know, help you out rather than cut you off, hopefully. One gentleman was talking about having done a research project with community and then done a similar kind of project, but with academic input from the outset, and how much depth, that was an archive project, and he was saying how much depth that added to the work, not just in terms of the comprehension and interrogation of the documents. He said, you know, we moved from indexing to interrogation, which is very useful, but also for the volunteers and participants themselves. It gives them a new insight into the value of what they're finding out, or into kind of, you know, the connections that they can then make, because there's an academic or someone who knows their stuff is sort of saying, well, try this, try that. Have you thought about it this way?
Under the heading of challenges, I've got that the amount of time and effort it takes to conduct evaluation can be a problem for people. Some respondents said that it was a project in itself, completing evaluation, that it was a lot of time to complete it, and particularly for smaller groups, they didn't have the human resource to be able to do it as well as they perhaps would have liked to have done. Related to that, they found potentially it can be quite disruptive. That people are in a good flow, they had a great event, and everybody's really happy, and then they turn up with the questionnaires, the dreaded questionnaires, and they need to be responded to. More conceptually, some of the things that we try and achieve are quite difficult to measure or to quantify. The golden one was engagement. How do you measure how engaged an audience was? Are they still awake by the end of it is one way of looking at it, but what have they learned? What have they been able to take away? And is that meaningful? And how can we sort of handle that? In some cases, people had quite a few different masters to serve, particularly groups where there was multiple funders. So they were responding to, in part to Heritage Lottery Fund, in part to perhaps the council, to a university, or to some other funding body or other authority that they needed to satisfy. And in a lot of cases, the measures that they were using aren't compatible with one another, which meant that they were just duplicating in different ways their evaluation process. And there was a fear that perhaps as more and more groups are requiring to seek multiple funders, that this might become a more pronounced problem in the future. In some cases, some people felt vulnerable, that it felt a bit like reporting to teacher. They needed to say certain things and to demonstrate that they've done the right thing, whereas perhaps even the funder wanted just genuine, open and honest feedback, but there was this tension there that the respondents felt that they needed to say the right things, else they'll be struck off and forbidden from applying again. And it was noted that charities in particular feel vulnerable about that because of the nature of their constitutions. However, in the response column, we had some really wonderful responses to these sets of problems. Overall, the key one was to be creative. There were several people that said that the questionnaire model doesn't really work, and so they tried different methods of doing that. Quite a popular one was the use of postcards. To give service users, for want of a better term, postcards, and then give them the space to go and write some of the things that they've learned, anything they wanted to. I did ask whether there was any sort of prompts that could be used for that, but it was felt that actually no, going without prompts, just giving people the blank space and the opportunity to express themselves was much more valuable. In some cases this was done with interviews. People were videoed and encouraged to talk about what they wanted to review. And overall, a sense of a discursive evaluation. The idea that people are in a dialogue and they can have a conversation about what they've learned is a better way of capturing that wonderful engagement that might have taken place. To give people the freedom and the space and the anonymity to respond in an open and honest way, but to keep it simple. Don't over-evaluate, don't over-ask the question or ask too many questions, but give people room just to sort of concentrate in more detail on a few items than very shallowly across many. And in response to, is this all compatible? Can it all be made to fit with the central evaluation models? I was told, just whack it all in, just stick it all in there, and it'll all be good in the end. Thank you.
I think the greatest sense that came out of this is that it depends on the nature of the project. Initially, there's a lot of people talking about how their projects did engender a sense of place, such as the New Haven project, which is site-specific, collecting local stories, engaging the community there, and everyone enjoying these wonderful outcomes, the theatre productions, that sort of thing. And the Cardiff project was very much a local project that they were talking about. There's also a walking tour of Manchester, looking at pointing out specific houses where women protesters, peace protesters had lived, and that did all engender a sense of space. But there was also this idea that, of course, there are going to be projects that are more thematic or might be focusing on something that is spread throughout, and not only the UK, but it could be a global issue. But for instance, we had someone talking about their project about the YMCA, which is not going to be fixed in any specific place. An interesting point was made by a gentleman who came from Belfast. He was saying that he worked in, his project was based on East Belfast, and of course the boundaries of East Belfast 100 years ago have shifted and aren't necessarily the same boundaries as what would be recognised as East Belfast today. Not only that, but the demographic has shifted. So all of this has got to be taken into account with collecting stories. So what does that sense of place mean when you're looking at those issues? Also, I think that when you are devising this project, trying to make the funders understand that it was okay to look at just one specific part of Belfast, as in East Belfast was problematic at first, but you got there in the end. Another important point that came up is if we're looking at particular communities, especially, I'm thinking small rural communities or whatever, if your family history doesn't go back very far in that community, for instance, did you have family representation in that community or people that you knew in that community from 100 years back, then you're involved in the project. If not, what have you got to add to the project? So it could be quite exclusive to certain people. It's about being, that's quite an important thing to bear in mind.
So you, as a group of people, said things in slightly different ways, but I think I can summarize it into 6 points. And I think there's a surprising amount of similarity. So 1, you said it really matters to be relational. Communication matters. It matters to listen. Not everybody has that skill. Think about putting your best person forward to front stuff. Get out of the ivory tower, go to the community. And some people even said in certain circumstances it might be good not to call yourself an academic. Okay, I thought it was funny. Okay, 2, clarify objectives. Try really hard to think about what you can offer and what you want. Try and make it explicit. Mutuality matters, so even if the outputs you each want are different, make sure it sort of levels out somehow. If you're interested in co-production, think about looking at community-based participatory research principles. 3, acknowledge different expertises. 4, offer skills and resources. 5, it can be difficult to find the right match, so anything you can do to create opportunities to help this happen. Really think about taking advantage of community brokers and community intermediaries. And 6 is a slight miscellaneous. I've got, it would be fabulous to have some sort of central hub so that we know what others are doing in this field. If you're interested in Black history and World War I, seriously look internationally, because stuff's happening in North America and other places. And finally, anything you can do to try and break down preconceived ideas and assumptions about what academics are like would be worth your while.